So we talked about God's story, and we're going to switch gears and kind of talk about the U.S. story and see if there's some parallels. So in terms of our U.S. housing policy story, it starts about 100 years ago. And it initially started with someone by the name of, it was the Hull House, Jane Addams. She won the Nobel Peace Prize, the first social worker ever. She invented the concept of social work. She moved in intentionally, kind of like Jesus moving into the hood, kind of like what I did with the Harambe Center, moving into an African-American low-income community. And so she moved into the heart of Chicago and began to listen. She began to listen to what the concerns and issues and needs were. And they began to do social research. And they thought about how many deaths in that community and what's causing those deaths. And that's when they realized that ventilation in the tenements was atrocious. So that was the first building codes ever to require that you put ventilation in a home. And so you can imagine, since then, all the codes. Any of you city planners? So you know the books and piles of codes required now. So that adds a tremendous amount of cost to housing. And we need those codes. When you go to Mexico and you build a house, you can do it in a weekend. You can't really do that here unless you're part of Habitat and you've got it all planned, you know. But typically with all the regulations, it adds a lot of cost. And so we need to figure that out and how to maybe cut down on some of that regulation, but we still want it environmentally wise and safe. So the next laws and policies in our country came to zoning. And so zoning is really interesting. It's a double-edged sword because it provides, you don't want a factory right next door to a home. You know, you need to have some regulation of how a city is planned. But at the same time, what started happening, if you look at, and I think it's the same here as it is in Pasadena. In Pasadena, you see wide streets with big mansions and little back houses. And the next street is small and narrow with smaller homes. It was a very much mixed income community. You had the servants and the maids. They were all living in the same community together. That was before 1920, before zoning laws. And then in 1920, they started saying, okay, let's just put all single-family homes here. Let's put all multifamily housing here. Before that, it was very mixed. You see the little bungalow courts. Those were typically built before the 1920s and before they were making everything all a single-family community. And so you started separating uses. And so all of a sudden today you've got gated communities with huge big homes, and the poor people are clear over in another part of town. And so we don't have relationships with each other. We don't know each other's stories. We aren't connecting in any meaningful way. So zoning is a huge issue around housing. So what they started doing is using zoning laws to separate people racially. And so we have, I think you said, when I met you, John, that on the deed of your house, that you can actually see that this home will never be bought by someone of color. So it was legal in our country. And almost every city across our nation had these racial covenants so that those people wouldn't come into our neighborhood. And so this was the negative side of zoning that started segregating our nation across our country. There's still long shadows of these. We still have that part of town. And how do you begin to undo that? Well, a lot of housing policy is doing everything they can to try to undo that. But today we're having to revisit these zoning laws and what they're actually doing. So real estate practices. I just the other day, I heard someone say that they were told that they couldn't buy a home because they were a person of color. That's illegal. You can't do that. But it still persists. There's still some of this going on, and people don't realize that there's laws, that fair housing laws. My neighbor up the street African American, she and her husband had cash to pay for a house. And they looked all over Pasadena, they couldn't find a house. And they point blank, this was in 1963, they said, well, we can't sell to you, you're a person of color. And so she came to my neighborhood, and there was a guy across the street who had listed that house. And they said, oh, would you like to look at it? Sure, I'd be glad to show it to you. Well, they now own 5 homes on the house. They're very wealthy people. They're a wonderful couple. But here in Monrovia, very similar things took place. You can see this Todd Forrest Hooks. He tried to buy a house north of the 210 back in the day, and it was not allowed. Same with Lois Gaston. Some of you probably know her. She wanted to buy a house in Monrovia, north of the freeway, and was not allowed to do that. So she ended up buying in Duarte, where they would have let her buy a house. What I think was really interesting in Todd's history, they had over 5,000 acres of land in Texas. But she comes here in Monrovia and couldn't buy a house. Thankfully, these laws are being undone, but we still see the shadows of this kind of persistence, lower income ethnic neighborhoods that aren't mixed. So the 1949 Federal Housing Act said a beautiful statement, a decent home, suitable living environment for every American. Beautiful. But what happened is that they had money to clear slums. And so there was what they called slums just because people of color lived in those neighborhoods. So hundreds and thousands of homes across our nation have been demolished, perfectly good homes, using federal funded money to create civic centers and to do all these things in the name of doing something good, but in reality it was displacing our lower income residents and people of color. The Highway Act did the same thing. Federally subsidized money. So you've got people in Pasadena that could afford to have a car, could go out and create the suburbs, La Cañada and different places to have their beautiful homes. And it emptied out Northwest. People of color that lived in Northwest, they had redlining, they weren't allowed to they are allowed to have, get loans to improve their properties. But people that could afford to move out did. And so it started cycling Northwest Pasadena down. Then the highway came through and just sliced right through the middle of a thriving African American neighborhood. And you'll see this in cities across our nation. And then finally, people were fed up. The civil rights era took place and saying, we're tired of this. We don't want this to continue. We finally passed some policies that were beginning to change. The Poor People's Campaign, we just celebrated this at the Palm Sunday Peace Parade a few weeks ago. And that was the last thing that Martin Luther King worked on. And his proposals were amazing. It was all about housing. Being able to construct 500,000 houses a year until we ended all slum housing, and to undo segregation. So a lot of the housing projects have been dismantled, the public housing. Some of that still exists. It's the lowest income housing we have in our country. It's still good, stable housing, but it was built with too high a density in a separate part of the city. You have to have the right kind of density in the right part of town. And that's why zoning laws are important, but we need to, I really thank God for the way that Monrovia has allowed no density caps down by the freeway. They're going to allow the density that's needed to create some affordability. If you have a set aside, you have to have enough set aside of affordable housing in that. So this woman, Dorothy Guttrow, she's changed housing policy forever. She had a lawsuit against the Chicago Housing Authority as a single family, as a single mom. She said, it's not right that I have no choice other than to raise my children in an all-black, low-income community. I need more choices than that for my children. So she challenged the Chicago Housing Authority, became a class action lawsuit, and it ended up completely, the settlement required that they put bits of affordable housing throughout the whole city of Chicago in every single neighborhood. And they studied those families. for 10 years, and in every single case they improved. They got better jobs just by moving them to a better neighborhood. And part of my doctoral work at the Harambe Center, I did the same thing. I interviewed 7 gang members, and my big question is, why did you get into a gang? What was going on with your family? What was happening? My assumption was that they were that they didn't have a good family structure, and they didn't have a sense of belonging. My assumptions were all wrong. The more I asked all my questions, I learned that they were all dropped out of school because every one of them had been put into special ed. Well, these were really smart kids. They shouldn't have been put in special ed. They couldn't stand the stigma, so they dropped out of school. And because of a segregated neighborhood, they all found each other and they formed a gang. But I asked them about their families. Their families prayed together for meals. Their families went to church. I was blown away. I had no idea that these gang kids were involved in that way. But they said, Jill, we don't have role models. I said, you're kidding. You go to church, you know? And so it was a very interesting exploration. But one of those kids said, this is the deal. My brother was taken out of our family and put into East Pasadena in a better part of town. And he is the only one that graduated from high school in our family, just by moving him to a different part of town. And he also went to college. So, so gentrification now, the sprawl has hit the wall. That's the name of one of the publications on land use in LA, and people are not willing to drive any further. So those inner city areas like Northwest Pasadena that were emptied out with all kinds of struggling families, now everybody's buying those homes because they don't want to drive any further. So you know what that does? It pushes out those low-income people even more and makes it impossible for them to live. So we wonder why we have homeless and why we have struggling. So these are just images of cities that we love from famous painters. And they're very high density. We need to get used to some of this. We need to be willing to have, in appropriate places, high density. So we're going to play this game. We're behind time. I apologize. So we just have a little bit of time. I want my assistant, Zurai.